Chapter 2. About Cumana. The captain of the Pizarro conducted Humboldt and Bonpland to Don Vincente and Paran, the governor of the province, that they might present to him the passports which they had been furnished them by the Secretary of the State of Madrid. He received them with much cordiality, and expressed his great satisfaction at the resolution that they had taken to remain for some time in the province, which at that period was little known, even by name, in Europe. Senor Emparan was a lover of science, and the public marks of consideration which he gave them during a long abode in his government contributed greatly to procure them a favorable welcome in every part of South America. The city of Cumana occupied the ground lying between the castle of San Antonio and the small rivers of the Manzanares and Santa Catalina. The banks of the Manzanares were very pleasant and were shaded by mimosas, etherias, celebas, and other trees of gigantic growth. The children of Cumana passed a considerable part of their lives in its waters. All the inhabitants, even the women of the most opulent families, knew how to swim. And in a country where man was so near the state of nature, one of the first questions asked on meeting in the morning was whether the water was cooler than it was on the preceding evening. One of the modes of the bathing was curious. Every evening, Humboldt and Bonpland visited a family in the suburb of the Guayqueras. In a fine moonlight night, chairs were placed in the water. The men and women were lightly clothed and the family and strangers assembled in the river, passed some hours in smoking cigars, and in talking according to the custom of the country, of the extreme dryness of the season, of the abundant rains in the neighboring districts, and particularly of the extravagances of which the ladies of Cumana accused those of Caracas and Havana. The company were likely under no apprehensions from the small crocodiles, which were then extremely scarce, and which approached men without attacking them. These animals were 3 or 4 feet long. Humboldt never met with them in the Manzanares, but found a great number of dolphins, which sometimes ascended in the river in the night, and frightened the bathers by spouting water. The situation of the house which Humboldt and Bonpland occupied was highly favorable for the observation of the stars and meteorological phenomena. The view from it by day, however, was by no means pleasant to them, for parts of the great square on which it was faced was surrounded with arcades, above which was one of the long wooden galleries. In warm countries, this was the place where slaves were sold. The slaves were exposed to sale when were young men from 15 to 20 years of age. Every morning, coconut oil was distributed among them, for which they rubbed their bodies to give their skins a black polish. The persons who came to purchase examined the teeth to judge their age and health, forcing open their mouths as if they had been horses in a market. The first excursion of the travelers was to the peninsula of Araya. They embarked on the Rio Manzanares on the 19th of August, about 2 in the morning. The principal objects of this excursion were to see the ruins of the Catalo of Araya, to examine the salt works, and to make a few geological observations on the mountains forming the narrow peninsula of Manicoras. The night was distinctly cool. Swarms of phosphorescent insects glistened in the air, and over the groves of mimosa which bordered the river. When, on the descending the river, they drew near plantations, they saw bonfires kindled by the blacks. A night in undulating smoke rose to the tops of the palm trees and imparted a reddish hue to the disk of the moon. It was on a Saturday night, and the slaves were dancing to the music of the guitar. The bark in which they passed the Gulf of Carico was very spacious. Large skins of the jaguar or American tiger were spread for their repose during the night. Though they had been scarcely 2 months yet in the torrid zone, they had already become so sensible to the smallest variation of the temperature that the cold prevented them from sleeping. They landed at Aria and examined the salt works. Having finished their operations, departed at sunset to sleep at an Indian hut some miles distant near the ruins of the castle of Aria. Night overtook them while they were in a narrow path bordered on one side by the sea, and on the other by a range of perpendicular rocks. The riptide was rising rapidly, and narrowed the road at every step. They at length arrived at the foot of the old castle of Aria, where they enjoyed a prospect that had in it something melancholy and romantic. The ruins stood on a bare and arid mountain, which was crowned with agave, cactus, and thorny mimosas, and bore less resemblance to the works of man than to the masses of rocks which were ruptured at the early revolution of the globe. Among the mulattoes whose huts surrounded the salt lake, they found a shoemaker of Castilian descent. He received them with an air of gravity and self-sufficiency. He was employed in stretching the string of his bow and sharpening his arrows to shoot birds. His trade of a shoemaker was not very lucrative in a country where the greater part of the inhabitants went barefooted, and he complained that on account of the dreariness of the European gunpowder, a man of his quality was reduced to employ the same weapons as the Indians. He was the sage of the plain. He understood the formation of the salt by the influence of the sun and full moon, the symptoms of earthquakes, the marks by which mines of gold and silver were discovered, and the medicinal plants which he classified into hot and cold. Having collected the traditions of the country, he gave them some curious accounts of the pearls of Cubangua, objects of luxury which he treated with utmost contempt to show the travelers how familiar to him were the sacred writings. He took a pride in reminding him that Job preferred wisdom to all the pearls of the Indies. His philosophy was circumscribed to the narrow circle of the wants of life. The possession of a very strong ass, able to carry a heavy load of plantains to the landing place, was the consummation of all his wishes. After a long discourse on the emptiness of human greatness, he drew from a leathern pouch a few very small opaque pearls, which he forced Humboldt to accept, and joining him at the same time to note on his tablets that a poor shoemaker of Aria, but a white man and of noble Castilian race, had been enabled to give him something which, on the other side of the sea, was sought for as very precious. In the morning, the son of the Indian host conducted them to the village of Maniquarez. On their way, they examined the ruins of Santiago. The structure of which was remarkable for its extreme solidity. The walls of the freestone, 5 feet thick, had been blown up by mines, but they still found masses of 700 or 800 square feet, which had scarcely had a crack in them. Their guide showed them a cistern 30 feet deep, which, though much damaged, furnished water to the inhabitants of the peninsula of Aria. After having examined the envisions of Maniquaras, they embarked at night in a fishing boat for Cumana. The small crazy boats employed by the natives here bore testimony to the extreme calmness of the sea in these regions. The boat to the travelers, though the best they could procure, was so leaky that the pilot's son was constantly employed in bailing out the water with a calabash shell. Their first visit to the peninsula of Aria was soon succeeded by an excursion to the mountains of the missions of the Chayma Indians. On the 4th of September at 5 in the morning, they began their journey on account of the extreme difficulties of the road. They had been advised to reduce their baggage to a very small bulk. 2 beasts of burden were sufficient to carry the provisions, their instruments, and the paper necessary to dry their plants. The morning was deliciously cool. The road which led to the Cumanakawa ran along the right bank of the Manazares, passing by the hospital of the Capuchins. On leaving Cubana, they enjoyed their short duration of the twilight from top of the hill of San Francisco. An extensive view over the sea, the plain covered with golden flowers, and the mountains of the Brigantine. After walking 2 hours, they arrived at the foot of the high chain of the interior mountains, which stretched from east to west, from the Brigantine to Cerro de San Lorenzo. There, new rocks appeared, and with them other aspects of vegetation. Every object assumed a more majestic and picturesque character. The soil, watered by springs, was furrowed in every direction. Trees of a gigantic height, covered with lilianas, rose from the ravines, their bark black and burnt by the double action of the light and the oxygen of the atmosphere, contrasted with the fresh verdure of the pothos and dracundium, the tough, shining leaves of which were sometimes several feet long. From the top of a hill of sandstone, they had a magnificent view of the sea of Cape Macano and the peninsula of Maniquaras. At their feet, an immense forest extended to the edge of the ocean. The tops of the trees, intertwined with lianas and crowned with long wreaths of flowers, formed a vast carpet of verdure, the dark tint of which augmented the splendor of the aerial light. In proportion as they penetrated into the forest, the barometer indicated this progressive elevation of the land. The trunks of the trees here presented like a curious phenomenon. For a gramineous plant like a liana, 8 or 10 feet high, formed festoons which crossed the path and swung about in the wind. They halted in the afternoon on a small flat known by the name of Quetepe. A few small houses had been erected near a spring, well known by the natives for its coolness and great salubrity. They found the water delicious. As they advanced towards the southwest, the soil became dry and sandy. They climbed a great group of mountains which separated the coast from the vast plains or savannas bordered by the Orinoco. The part of the group over which passed the road to Cumanacoa was destitute of vegetation and had steep declivities, both on the north and south. It was known by the name of the Impossible, because it was believed that in the case of the hostile invasion, the ridge of mountains would be inaccessible to the enemy, and would offer asylum to the inhabitants of Cumana. The view from the Impossible was finer and more extensive than that from the tableland of Qutepe. Humboldt distinguished clearly by the naked eye the flattened top of the Brigantine, the landing place, and the roadstead of Cumana. The rocky coast of the peninsula of Area was discernible in its whole length. The travelers were particularly struck by the extraordinary configuration of a port, known by the name Laguna Grande, a vast basin surrounded by high mountains, communicated with the Gulf of Carico by a narrow channel which admitted of the passage of only one ship at a time. This port was capable of containing several squadrons at once. It was an uninhabited place, but annually frequented by vessels, which carried mules to the West India Islands. Humboldt traced the sinuosities of this arm of the sea, which, like a river, had dug a bed between the perpendicular rocks. Destitute of vegetation, the prospect here reminded him of the fanciful landscape which Leonardo da Vinci has made the background of his famous portrait of Mona Lisa, the wife of Francisco del Giocondo. The Lanceros, or inhabitants of the plains, lent their produce, especially maize, leather, and cattle, to the port of Cumana by the road over the Impossible. Humboldt and Bonpland continually saw mules arrive, driven by Indians or mulattoes. Several parts of the west of the vast forest which surrounded the mountain had taken fire, and reddish flames half enveloped the clouds of smoke, presented a grand spectacle. The inhabitants frequently set fire to the forest to improve the pasturage and destroy the shrubs that choked the grass. Enormous configurations, too, were often caused by the carelessness of the Indians, who neglect when they travel to extinguish the fires by which they dress their food. They left the Impossible hole early in the morning of the 5th of September. The path was dangerous for their beasts, being in most places but 15 inches broad, and bordered by the precipice. When they quitted it, it was to enter a thick forest traversed by many small rivers. They walked for some hours in the shade of the forest, and with scarcely a glimpse of the sky. In this place they were struck for the first time with the sight of nests in the shape of bottles or small bags, suspended from the branches of the lowest trees, and attesting the wonderful industry of the orioles that mingled their warbling with the hoarse cries of the parrots and the macaws. They left the forest, and taking a narrow path with many windings, came into an open but humid country, where the evaporation caused by the action of the sun was so great that they were wet as with a vapor bath. The road was bordered with a kind of bamboo more than 40 feet in height. Nothing could exceed its elegance. Its smooth and glossy trunk generally bent towards the banks of the rivulets, and it waved with the lightest breath of air. The road led them to the small village of San Fernando, which was situated in a narrow plain and surveyed by steep rocks. This was the first mission they saw in America. The huts of the Chayama Indians, though separated from each other, were not surrounded by gardens. The streets, which were wide and very straight, crossed each other at right angles. The walls of the huts were made of clay and strengthened by lianas. The uniformity of these huts, the grave and taciturn air of their inhabitants, and the extreme neatness of the dwellings reminded Humboldt of the establishments of the Moravian Brethren. Besides their own gardens, every Indian family helped to cultivate the garden of the community, which was situated at some distance from the village. In this garden, the adults of each sex worked 1 hour in the morning and 1 in the evening. The great square of San Fernando in the center of the village contained the church and the dwelling of the missionary, and a very humble-looking edifice pompously called the King's House. That was a caravanserai destined for lodging travelers, and as our travelers often experience, infinitely valuable in a country where the name of an inn was unknown. The missionary of San Fernando was a Capuchin, a native of Oregon, far advanced in years but strong and healthy. His extreme corpulency, his hilarity, the interest he took in battles and sieges ill accorded with the ideas we form of the melancholy reveries and the contemplative life of missionaries. Though extremely busy about a cow which was to be killed next day, the old monk received Humboldt and Bonpland with kindness and permitted them to hang up their hammocks in a gallery of his house. Seated without doing anything the greater part of the day in an armchair of red wood, he complained bitterly of what he called the indolence and ignorance of his countrymen. The sight of Humboldt's instruments and books and the dried plants of Bonpland drew from him a sarcastic smile, and he acknowledged with the naivete peculiar to the inhabitants of those countries that of all the enjoyments of life, without excepting sleep, none were comparable to the pleasure of eating good beef.